All right, today we start Unit 4, which is the Age of Enlightenment, mostly 18th century, and I call this the era of reason and revolution. So, starting with this unit here, we have the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution. So, what this was, it was a movement, kind of the emergence of what we now call modern science toward the end of the Renaissance. Okay, this movement took place from the mid 1500s all the way up until 1700, which is when the Enlightenment began, which we'll talk about next class, right? But for starters, we're going to talk about the scientific revolution. So, modern science was a new way of thinking about the natural world based on very careful observation and really the willingness to question old beliefs that people had. For example, the belief that the sun revolved around the earth. That was a very common belief. People had no reason to not believe that. But then new theories came about that, well, in fact, maybe the Earth does revolve around the sun. So that's just one example of something that was brought up during the scientific revolution. So a lot of different changes, a lot of different developments in our thought process happened during this time. A lot of developments in math and physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, you name it, all sorts of academic subjects that are in school today. Had a lot of different developments and creations at this time. Now, these new discoveries and theories really changed society's views about nature and humanity, started to see things in a much different way. And this movement also influenced the Enlightenment, which was the intellectual social movement of the 1700s, which we'll be getting into next class. Now, something important to keep in mind as we talk about several scientists at this time, we're going to talk about four major scientists who really changed a lot during the scientific revolution, is that they did not call themselves scientists. That was not really a term that was used. Instead, they referred to themselves as natural theologians. Now, we've talked about the term theology, and that's basically a detailed teaching about what one believes about the supernatural and why. So, scientists, for example, Isaac Newton, who we're going to be talking about, he did not call himself a scientist. He called himself a natural theologian because he looked into nature to figure out more about what he believed to be God's creation. So the first scientist we're going to talk about is Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus, all right. So he was a Polish scientist, and he was the first one to challenge accepted thinking in science and astronomy. All right. So the typical way of thinking, what most people believed, is that the sun revolved around the Earth. That's called the geocentric theory, the geocentric model. And Copernicus had a different idea. He believed that the sun did not revolve around the Earth, but that in fact the Earth revolved around the sun. Okay, so that theory is called the heliocentric theory, or a sun-centered solar system instead of the Earth at the center. And this went against the widely accepted geocentric theory, or Earth-centered. Pretty much all of the what we would call scientists of that day believed in geocentricity, that the Earth was at the center and everything revolved around the Earth. But Copernicus said that he thought that everything revolved around the sun. Now, he actually did not publish his findings until right before he died. And the reason why he kept quiet about his theories and his evidence for his theories was because he was afraid that he'd be attacked for going against society's teachings and the church's teachings as well. So the church taught that everything revolved around the earth, and he was afraid that he might get punished, kind of like Martin Luther did when he came up with theories or ideas that contradicted what the church taught. So he did not want to be killed for being a heretic or anything like that. So he kept quiet about his findings until right before his death. Okay, but then other people started reading about this new heliocentric theory that maybe, in fact, the Earth does revolve around the sun instead of vice versa. And then other people came along after him and proved his theory. So one person who came along after him, his name was Johannes Kepler. Now, he was a German scientist, lived in the Holy Roman Empire, and about 100 years after Copernicus theorized his idea of heliocentricity, which means sun-centered universe, Kepler used math and astronomy in order to prove Copernicus correct. All right, so what he did was every night he went to observe the stars and he had a wall where he marked along the wall where a star passed in the night sky, and through very careful observation of the movement of stars and planets, he was able to prove that, in fact, the Earth does go around the sun instead of vice versa. Now, someone came around the same time named Galileo Galilei. I'm sure you've heard of Galileo, and he was an Italian scientist. Now, he made several discoveries that also undercut these ancient ideas, just like Copernicus and Kepler did. Galileo, he made one of the first ever telescopes, and he used it to study the planets. He studied the stars and the planets pretty much every night with his telescope. Now, some of his teachings about the Earth, the sun, the planets, all of that kind of went against the teachings of the Catholic Church. Remember, that's why Copernicus did not publish his findings until right before he died, because it contradicted what the Catholic Church said about the Earth being the center of the universe physically. So church authorities, whenever they heard Galileo talking about how the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around and things like that, they forced Galileo to recant. I remember just how the church tried to get Martin Luther to recant or take back what he said, and Martin Luther refused, and then a price was on his head, and he almost got killed. Galileo, they did the same thing to him, tried to force him to recant, and it actually worked with Galileo. So Galileo recanted because he didn't want to die. I didn't think it was worth risking his life over, so he did recant, even though he still believed in his theories. And then the church put him under house arrest for the rest of his life. All right, so he wasn't executed because he did recant, but then he was put on house arrest. All right, so big question is, why was Johannes Kepler allowed to talk about his theories of heliocentricity, while Galileo and Copernicus were not able to without being punished? And the answer for that is because Kepler lived in a Protestant principality of the Holy Roman Empire, where the Pope and the Church did not really have as much power. Okay, so they thought he was a heretic anyway. He was protected within his state of the Holy Roman Empire, so he was able to say what he wanted. There was a little bit more freedom of speech in Protestant areas than in areas controlled by the Pope at that time. And then, of course, we get to Sir Isaac Newton. He came a little bit later, in the 1600s, early 1700s, and he was an English scientist. All right. So the four most important scientists of the scientific revolution, arguably, they were all from different countries. Okay? Copernicus was Polish, Galileo was Italian, Kepler was German, and Newton was English. All right. And Newton described the law of gravity. Okay? The first person to come up with the idea of gravity, a force actually keeping us here on this earth, keeping everything together. And using mathematics, Newton showed that this same force that he called gravity rules both the motion of the planets and the action of bodies on Earth. That it's not just confined to certain areas, but that gravity actually causes things to revolve around each other. Okay? It causes the Earth to revolve around the sun. It causes the moon to revolve around the Earth. And he also led to a much clearer understanding of both Earth and space. Whenever you understand gravity, you understand physics a lot better, all right? So this whole concept of modern physics, he laid the foundation for, and he was also the founder of calculus, okay? The math subject calculus. You might take that in college, very advanced math, and he was the first one to theorize it. He also made the laws of motion. You might have heard of them, his three laws of motion, things like every action has an equal and opposite reaction. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. An object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by a force. Things like that. Those were all Newton's ideas. So very intellectual person, very important person to history. In fact, if you remember me talking about that TV special I watched in 1999 of the 100 most influential people of the past 1,000 years, he was number 2. Okay, remember Gutenberg was number 1, Martin Luther was number 3 on that list, and Sir Isaac Newton was number 2 for all the advancements that he made in math and science and technology. So some of the inventions of the scientific revolution, we already talked about the telescope. Also the microscope was invented during the scientific revolution, so you could examine things much more closely. Also, basic weather tools were invented at this time to where you could start predicting the weather with a small degree of certainty. And also, vaccines were first used at this time. Also, a lot of facts about the human body were discovered at this time by examining cadavers, dead bodies, and doing experiments and things like that. We were able to learn a lot about the body. For example, one fact that we learned at this time was that the heart pumps blood. Sounds really simple, right? Everybody knows that now, but at this time, it was just being discovered that that is actually the purpose of the heart, to pump blood and to keep us alive in that way. Now, one idea kind of formed at this time called skepticism. Okay, so skepticism was this kind of extreme idea that formed mostly as a reaction to so many religious wars in Europe. Right, so a lot of the wars in Europe at this time, like the 30 Years' War, for example, a lot of them were about religion. A lot of them were Protestants versus Catholics, and so a lot of people kind of got tired of the idea of religion in general because it had caused wars in the past. And so a lot of them just kind of like ran from the whole idea of religion in general. So skepticism was kind of what a lot of people ran to, this idea that absolutely nothing can be known for certain, and that we should doubt all old ideas and beliefs simply because they are old. Now, the four scientists that we just talked about, they would probably say that skeptics went way too far with the scientific method, whereas the four scientists we talked about would say we shouldn't doubt all ideas just because they're old. We should doubt ideas and beliefs if there isn't evidence for it. Okay, so they were very much driven by evidence, not just an overall doubt or questioning of all things. Period. Okay, so skepticism probably went a little too far with the ideas of the scientific revolution. Okay, and then came the Glorious Revolution. Okay, going back to English history, when we last left English history, we had the English Civil War with the death of Charles I, and then Oliver Cromwell, and then Charles the II came back, and the monarchy was restored. Well, when Charles II died in 1685, his younger brother James II came to the throne in England. Okay, and he was still a part of the Tudor dynasty that we're talking about here. And James II wanted to bring Catholicism back to England. And a lot of people really did not like that. They had been Protestant for well over a century by this point. They did not want to go back to the days of Queen Mary or pre-King Henry VIII. And so Parliament asked William of Orange, who was the leader of the Dutch Republic in the Netherlands at this time, Parliament asked them to invade England and overthrow King James. So that's exactly what he did. And this was called the Glorious Revolution because from a Protestant perspective, it was seen to preserve and save Protestantism in England and keep them from descending into another civil war. So William and his wife Mary became king and queen of England, William and Mary. And they were in power for 14 years. In fact, one of the oldest colleges here in America is called the College of William and Mary because it was founded when they were king and queen of England. Now, in 1598, something called the Edict of Nantes was passed in France, the Edict of Nantes. And this document gave French Protestants, or Huguenots as they were called, I might want to remember that term, it gave Huguenots the right to live in peace and worship freely in France. Okay, so France at this time, just like it had been for the past 1,000 years really, was very, very Roman Catholic, still is today. But at that time, remember, there was a lot of persecution of Protestants, and then you even had some Protestants killing Catholics as well. Okay, so a lot of bloodshed and not much religious tolerance going on. But then in 1598, the French passed the Edict of Nantes, which gave religious freedom to the Huguenots, to the French Protestants, saying, hey, as long as you swear allegiance to the Catholic King of France, you can worship however you please. All right, so this was a big step forward for religious freedom. And then came Louis XIV. Okay, Louis XIV, kind of this larger-than-life figure who ruled France for 72 years. He called himself the Sun King. Ruled for 72 years, from 1643 all the way until 1715. So he was the longest reigning monarch in all of, of European history. No person has ever ruled a country for longer than Louis XIV in all of history. Louis XIV ruled the longest. So France was the most powerful country in Europe during a large chunk of his reign. France had a much larger population and a bigger army than really any other country around as a result of King Louis's policies. He built up the army, encouraged population growth, and also Louis was a Catholic, and he naturally did not like Protestants, just like most Protestants didn't like Catholics at the time. And remember, William and Mary, who had just conquered England, were Protestants. So he participated in several wars with William and Mary of England, who were Protestants. Remember, England and France have historically been enemies, just always at each other's throats. And then for some reason in the 20th century with the World Wars, that stopped, and they have been friends ever since. Now, the reason why Louis XIV insisted on being called the Sun King is because he believed in this idea called absolutism. And that is the idea that he had absolute power and authority over all of France. Absolute power means complete control. So he believed that one person should be in complete control, that he was ordained by God to be the absolute ruler of the Kingdom of France. And he believed that, as with the sun, all power radiated from him. Okay? He pretty much thought that he was the center of the world or of the universe, and therefore he insisted on being called the Sun King. Now, as a result of his vanity, okay, you can see in that picture there how, just think how much money all of that would have cost. Everything in the picture there, the golden scepter and the very ornate clothing there that he wore. And as a result of his vanity, he lived a life of complete luxury, built a very large, beautiful palace at Versailles near Paris, had literally hundreds of servants, and just basically saw their job to make him as comfortable and happy as possible. All right, so he was very much what you would think of when you think of an absolute monarch. Okay, someone who has total power over a region, and their people don't really have much freedom. Now, there are several ways that Louis XIV affected the Empire of France positively, and there are also ways that he impacted France negatively. So let's go with the positive first. One positive thing that Louis XIV did was he encouraged French people to settle in the New World, to settle in new French colonies in North America. All right, so all that area in the blue on the map there, all that land in the blue, that was called New France, and that was mostly explored and settled during King Louis XIV's reign. Also, he encouraged the fur trade there, the fur trade, trapping beavers and other animals and making pelts and furs and hats and things like that out of the hides of those animals, the fur of those animals. It brought a ton of wealth to France. Now, that's one big reason why they were so powerful and so wealthy during most of King Louis XIV's reign, is because of the fur trade in North America. Okay, so in the modern day Midwest, we would call it the Great Lakes area, and then also Canada. That was where New France really thrived. Louis was also a patron of the arts. He was a big believer in funding artists and musicians and architects, very much a believer in the ideals of the Renaissance. But there were also ways that Louis XIV affected the Empire of France very negatively. And one way is that he was very thirsty for war. Okay? He loved war, and he started several destructive and unnecessary conflicts with neighboring countries just in an attempt to expand France's territory. No real other reason besides that. Now, these wars were met with united resistance from the rest of Europe, and it was very bad for France's economy, kind of bankrupted France towards the end of Louis's reign, wasted all their money on these unnecessary wars, and because they were so unnecessary and deemed unjust by the rest of Europe kind of fought against him. So it kind of made enemies with other European countries for that reason, and then also wasted money both on the wars and then also on his extravagant spending and luxury. So by the end of Louis's reign, France was not nearly as powerful as it had been towards the beginning and middle of Louis's reign. Something also very negative that he did was he repealed the Edict of Nantes. He repealed this document that gave religious freedom to French Protestants, to Huguenots, and he began to persecute Protestants again. All right, so a big step backward for religious tolerance here and religious freedom. So definitely not good things he did. Okay, but as with most people in history, you have positive and negative things to say about him. Now, 17th century art was similar to the art of the Renaissance right before this time period. But after the Renaissance, while patronage for the arts continued, that continued to be funded, the center for the arts in Europe shifted from Italy and Germany into the Netherlands. The Netherlands became the place to go if you wanted to make it as an artist. Two of the greatest artists of the 17th century were Rembrandt and Vermeer. Okay, some would say two of the greatest artists of all time. They were both from the Netherlands in this time in the 17th century. Here's just one painting by Vermeer called "Girl with the Pearl Earring," one of the more famous paintings from that time. But again, you can kind of see that detailed realism, making things look very realistic, and people are still the center of art in early modern Europe, just like it was a century earlier during the Renaissance. Now we get into a little bit of Russian history, and one person who kind of transformed Russia into an empire, into the powerful country that it is today, was a guy named Peter. Okay, Peter the Great, as people called him. He ruled Russia from 1682 all the way until 1721. And through a series of successful wars, he was able to make Russia a major European power, which it has been ever since. Before this time, Russia was not really considered one of the great European powers. Even though it was the biggest European country, it was way less powerful than France and the Holy Roman Empire and England and Spain. Okay, but after Peter the Great, it became rivals with them, right up there in power and prestige, just like it is today. And today, Russia is actually the most powerful European country, second most powerful country in the world after the United States. Something else that Peter did was he founded the port city of St. Petersburg. This was a really big deal because for a very long time, Russia wanted a warm water port. All their port cities where ships could come in and come out for trade and for exploration and for travel, all of their ports would freeze over in the winter because Russia is so incredibly cold. So he wanted a place with water that was warm enough to where it wouldn't freeze over in the winter, and he founded the city of St. Petersburg. Now he said he named it after St. Peter, as in Jesus's disciple, but I have a suspicion that he named it after himself as well. So that was the beginning of St. Petersburg. And Peter the Great also led kind of a cultural revolution that replaced a lot of Russia's medieval traditions that were still around with more modern, more scientific customs that were based on the ideals of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which he fully embraced. Now, while the Renaissance was happening in Europe, what was happening in Asia, specifically in Japan, was not like the Renaissance at all. Okay, Renaissance in Europe was a time of a lot of rebirth and a lot of positivity, but at that same time in Japan, it couldn't have been more different. So from 1467 to 1568, all right, so over a 100-year period here, Japan had a very long, dark period of civil war. You had very powerful warriors called daimyo, and they took control of very large swaths of land and constantly fought each other to gain more territory from each other. All right, so you just had daimyo, these powerful warriors taking over chunks of land and just constantly, continually fighting, battling in order to gain more territory. All right, so not a great time to live in Japan. But then a guy in the late 1500s named Tokugawa Ieyasu, he unified Japan all under his control. Okay, so we've learned about a lot of people who have unified fragmented areas and how sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. Okay, remember back in ancient Greece, Philip II of Macedon united Greece under his control. That was positive because it stopped the fighting, but it was negative because it killed democracy. Okay, so similarly here, this had both positive and negative consequences when Tokugawa Ieyasu united Japan under his leadership. He became the shogun, or the sole ruler of Japan. Now, the first thing he did was he moved the capital of Japan to a very small fishing village named Edo. Now, whenever you think of the capital of a country, you think, okay, what's one of the biggest cities that we could move it to? But he wanted to move it to this small fishing village named Edo. Now, this later became known as Tokyo, one of the largest cities in the world. To where the 2020 Olympics are going to be held. Now, it was renamed Tokyo after him, after Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, before his death in 1616, after he had ruled Japan for several decades, he established a dynastic succession of power called the Tokugawa shogunate. All right, so he was smart. Before he died, he established who was going to be the next ruler, who was going to be after him, so there's not this power struggle like there was after the death of Genghis Khan, like there was after the death of Alexander the Great. Okay, all sorts of other rulers didn't really establish this succession of power for the peaceful transition of leadership. But he did after he died, and the Tokugawa shogunate, his dynasty, his family, ruled Japan all the way until 1867. Right, so they ruled Japan for nearly 300 years, very long time. Now, in the early 1600s, Tokugawa welcomed Europeans into Japan. He said, hey, this is good. They've been through a renaissance. We need a renaissance. So, yeah, welcome, come on in. But what caused this policy to change is that Europeans started to challenge traditional, old-fashioned, medieval Japanese beliefs, and they also got involved in politics. Now, Tokugawa became very worried that his country would be taken over by the Europeans. So, in order to, in his mind, protect Japan from that outward influence and from them potentially taking over his country, he banned Christianity and Europeans from Japan in the year 1612. Okay, so certainly not a good thing there. Okay, banning an entire continent, an entire religion from your country, and Christian missionaries were persecuted because of this, and Europeans were exiled because of this as well. And then in 1639, Japan sealed off all of its borders and isolated itself from all European contact for the next 200 years. All right, so you see here Japan kind of going the way of China, completely isolating itself, shutting itself off from all sorts of progress and influence from other places in the world. Okay, so that leads us up to in the 1800s when Japan would start to open up its borders again and become powerful, and that eventually led to Japan's role in World War II. Okay, but that's way in the future here. This is what you need to focus on for now. Okay, so that is early modern Europe, as we call it. Let me know if you have any questions.